Hi, my name is Danielle Henrici. I am the founding co-artistic director of Fenimore Art Museum's and the Farmers Museum's Glimmer Globe Theater. And this is Speak of Me as I Am, examining race in Othello. I am very, very happy to be joined by one of my castmates in the production.
Hi, my name is Omonike Akinyemi.
And Omonike played Othello. I was Desdemona to Omonike's Othello. And we're really looking forward to having a conversation about the play. Now, before we start to chat, I just wanted to give the audience watching a little bit of a foundational understanding of the play very briefly. It was written in 1603 by William Shakespeare. And the full title is Othello, the Moor of Venice. And it's just important to note that the term Moor at that time was not specifically referencing one particular ethnicity or race. It could have actually meant anybody from Africa or from the Middle East or even Spain. So it's very ambiguous in that sense. Over the last several centuries, the term has taken on a meaning where most people understand it to mean that Othello is Black. And there are a lot of references to Blackness in the play itself, in the language, which is probably why people make that inference. But again, that term is even ambiguous because in 1600, the term Black would have meant anybody darker skinned than the very, very white Englishman. So either way you look at it, Othello is meant to be the other. And that is so much of what the play is about and the themes that surround the play of race, of jealousy, obviously, and love. But race is what we're talking about today. So I want to jump right into this conversation and ask you, Omonike, what was your experience playing the role of Othello?
Playing the role of Othello was really a wonderful experience. It was amazing to get into a character that I really had to grapple with, to deal with him as a man, as a person who is trying to defend himself, defend his honor, defend his race in many ways, but also to get into the sensitive side of Othello, the person who wants to love, the person who wants all of the finer things in life that he sees in Desdemona. I felt that Shakespeare gave me an opportunity to react to racism that is presented in Othello's surrounding, but also to find ways in my body to deal with it, to deal with what the text gave and what it didn't give. So it was just an amazing opportunity to use text and also use the physicality of the body to deal with this man's transformation.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting too, because obviously race is used as a way to isolate one character from all the rest of the cast in this play, intentionally. So how did it feel as an actor and as on stage being the only person of color in a cast of otherwise white people?
Yeah. You know, there are definitely moments where I did feel isolated, where I did feel different because I was different, you know, but I often felt different also from Othello himself, you know, being a woman and now finding Othello within myself and accepting parts of what was given to me as who he was and also rejecting them. You know, there are parts of Othello I think he's in crisis with. You know, I think he's in crisis with the bigness of what he experienced as a war hero, as a warrior, and what he's feeling in his immediate, which is this love, this tenderness, this wanting to be in a domestic relationship. So there's just an otherness to that. he's a fish out of water in his own present relationship. He's not sure, what do? I know how to like go and strategize with military folk, but I'm not really sure how to bring myself into this marriage in a way that I feel safe. Definitely in terms of the physicality, the way Othello is presented, he is apart from the others. But I don't think as a character, he has a problem with that. His whole life has been about, going through, brushing through, like he's a Superman, tearing doors down and being strong and being able to be where he needs to be, strong, impressive. But then the otherness is, how do I, show this tenderness? How do I sustain it? He's presenting himself as this hero, and he's also thinking of Desdemona as this sweet virgin, very white and pure, which is its own racism,
Right.
Not.
Yeah.
She loves him in a very pure way. Her love is pure, but she's a girl from Venice. Mm-hmm. She is a Venetian, and that is what he eventually starts to think, oh, I have been played with, I don't really know this woman. He starts to play with, how well do I know my surroundings when his footing is not as solid as it seems, when Iago starts to pull at those strings and say, hey, why do you think she even likes a guy like you? He doesn't believe that he has what it takes to really attract Othello. And that is also the question my character has as a woman playing Othello. So it's doubly there,
Right. Yeah. I mean, you were, in two ways, you were dealing with being outside of this experience, I mean, as a woman playing a man, that is its own separate conversation, and I mean, we kept it fairly ambiguous intentionally, because I think, it was really interesting to create that sense of otherness in more ways than one. It gave our production, I think, a lot of dimension, and certainly race, just very simply, creates that appearance of otherness on stage, because there is one Black man or woman in your case, and then a whole cast of white individuals, and there's that really interesting dichotomy. So what would you say were the greatest challenges that you faced throughout the production?
Definitely a great challenge finding a way to justify the transformation in Act 3, to justify going there to that place where you feel Desdemona has betrayed you, because if you believe that you're betrayed, you must have believed at some point that you were not betrayed, that everything was okay. So I had to find ways to really grapple with it within the scenes with Iago, because I'm only given Iago to deal with at some points. Right. Desdemona comes in, but it's with Iago that I really start to go there and think, oh, she can't do it. Maybe she could do it. And then finally explode.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, because in order to fall in love with and marry Desdemona, he had to have had a sense of worthiness, in the same sense that she feels a sense of worthiness, like, am I worthy of this man? Because she adores you, she has you up on this pedestal. And so it's a really interesting question, is at what point does Othello suddenly question his value and his worth? you know, and you're right. I mean, that we talked about that transition, and I remember that really challenged you when we were rehearsing, was this, it does feel like he changes very quickly. And as you said, trying to justify that change as an actor, getting inside the head of the character you're playing. We're always looking for ways to justify. So yeah, it's really, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, you know, I don't think ever Othello feels just, you know. I feel he's presented as someone doing what is honorable always. That's the way his mind seems to work. But what I felt was I had to add a layer of understanding that that's really not the way it works, you know? So, and I think that is more of what a woman thinks about, you know, thinking about relationships and emotions. So I feel I brought that inherently to the character, you know?
Yeah, I mean, empathy is a really important quality of most good leaders. I say most, most good leaders, and so yeah, I think from your perspective, you probably had a lot of valuable insight into who this man was when he was at his best, and allowing him to fall is hard.
It is hard to let Othello fall, you know, because the Othello I knew as a kid before I even read the book was the Othello that, you know, my family showed me in our book about actors, and we had a book about Paul Robeson, you know, and he was a great Othello, big, strong, you know, and understanding that a man of that strength could also become a murderer is very hard for anyone, you know. And I think what it shows us is that we are all, no matter how strong we think we are, suspect or subject to the negativity that can come from our surroundings, you know, and we need to become aware of that and have each other's backs. You know, I think as the play goes along, you do see characters who start to come up. You know, Amelia, you know, who seems to buy into racism in the beginning, and then is like, you know, even turns her back on her own husband and says, "Hey, you know, you're my Desdemona is true. You're lying." So all of these things, it becomes very much an accusation of racism, really calling it by its name because Iago uses it, but it also is something that every character at some point kind of grapples with. You know, Othello's 360 is very quick, you know. I think too quick. In Act 3, he says, okay, Desdemona's false after all of Iago's tormenting him, but so does Amelia. And Desdemona has her own transformation as well. Towards the, you know, she's thinking, no, Othello would never do anything like that. And she's on her dying day and denies what has done, blaming her own self, you know. So there's a lot of layers, I think, in this play that have to deal with what happens when we realize we're in a racist situation. Or we're in a domestic abuse situation. What do we do? Can we even deal with that? You know, both these characters are in a society where it's very hard for them. You know, they would rather die themselves than really, I feel, deal with it. But I think it's a call to us, because we're the viewers, we're the audience, to really come up to the page, come up to the audience level and really look at it look at what has happened and say, is this what we want? You know, do we want death?
Yeah. Well, and that's the power of theater, right? Is shining light on something like this. I mean, for me personally, I've always believed that, and this informs me as an actor, I think, is the idea that we are all capable of all things, and we all feel all things, but to varying degrees, and it depends on our circumstances and our experiences.
Yes.
And so Othello is just as vulnerable as Desdemona, is just as vulnerable as Brabantio, is just as vulnerable as whatever has come before and what has brought them to that point.
Yes.
Yeah. The relationship between Desdemona and Othello is so pure at the beginning. They are just so deeply in love. And so it's so hard when you start to wrestle with this. And I remember you saying that you wished you could ask Shakespeare, why is the transition so quick? Why is it that the moment the seed is planted in Othello's head, that jealousy takes hold, or at least as soon as he sees the handkerchief in Cassio's hand or in his pocket, whatever it is, that it's so easy for the jealousy and the uncertainty to overwhelm him, and to taint this love that was so beautifully pure at the beginning. And so anyhow, I'll let you speak to that, because I'd love to ask Shakespeare questions too.
Yeah, I have a couple of theories about that, because I grapple with that. You know, on the one hand, I think it's so quick because perhaps Shakespeare doesn't really understand Othello. He may not really understand that guy. You know, Hamlet has that moment where he's like, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis noble in the eye. Hamlet self-analyzes, you know, but Othello, it's like he doesn't have that barrier that's able to see himself outside of himself when it really matters. And I think that might be partially Shakespeare otherizing Othello and seeing him as, okay, now we're going to let the Moor go crazy, because that's what they expected of Moors back then. They were the other. But then it's also possible to me that Othello is so broken that he snaps, that he really just does snap, like a person who's been through a war. You know, boom, someone hit that wrong button, that button that makes him question himself, question his race, and boom, everything's out.
Well, that was always kind of my theory, was that he's been beset throughout his life, and had to contend with racism throughout his life, and a lot of struggles. And so it's just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, in a sense. And that all his life, I mean, Brabantio, Desdemona's father, literally tells Othello that he's not good enough for her because of his race. And how could she love, I'm going to misquote it, but how could she love what she feared to look upon? You know, is what he says to her, and to all the folks at court. And so this is what Othello has been hearing. And all of a sudden, anybody offers the slightest bit of proof, and it's like he immediately, it just devastates him. Just this, what he perceives to be proof. And I mean, he does trust Iago. You know, Iago is supposedly his dear friend.
I believe Othello trusts Iago. You know, I feel he trusts Iago because he has no choice. You know, Othello is very isolated, and he has few friends that we know of. You know, Iago has been with him through many exploits. They've, you know, done things in war together. He knows Iago, you know, and when you're an outsider, I think you sometimes need someone you can trust. And I think Iago is for him that person. I think he wants to. It's not that he's naive. You know, Othello isn't a naive person. You know, he knows that there are people in the world you shouldn't trust. But it's almost that kind of, you know, grandmotherly, like something in that relationship he's bought into fully. And he's known Iago longer than he's known Desdemona.
Yeah, there's so much there. The relationships between the three of them, it is kind of like a little love triangle. And you could spend hours unpacking it all. But yeah, there are so many different theories on the love and hate between the three of them. Yeah, we could go on and on, couldn't we? I mean, Shakespeare was, you know, I mean, he was a man of his time, obviously, but I just wanted to put this out there because I think it's also really important to remember that Shakespeare really, really pushed the narrative forward. And I mean, Harold Bloom argued that the invention of the human, you know, but this idea that he wrote these incredibly powerful depictions of people in lower classes. Not always, I mean, a lot of times not, but women too. I mean, some incredibly powerful women, even though, you know, women weren't even allowed to step on a stage at that time. And to think that Othello is the protagonist of the play, you know, I mean, he is the play, he's the hero. He's noble and brave and accomplished and beloved. And Brabantio, Desdemona's father, is a patent racist. He is blatantly racist, and you're not supposed to like him or agree with what he's saying. And Iago is the villain. He's the antagonist, and he's pure evil, and he's white. And so Shakespeare made a person of color his hero. And the tragedy of the play is his downfall, and that's meaningful. You know, I mean, one could argue that racism is what undermines Othello and ultimately leads him to destroy those he loves as well as himself. And in this play, racism is the mechanism through which any vulnerability becomes a liability. And I know you and I talked about that a lot when last we spoke, and also while we were working on this play. But all that leads me to pose this question to you, which is, do you feel that the text itself is racist, or rather that the play sought to depict race and challenge conceptions of race, or both?
For me, it's a combination of both. You know, I feel there are times, especially in the beginning, where the text really soars and it depicts racism, you know, and it says, look, here is Brabantio. He is ugly. Look the way he's trying to take apart this man who is strong, who is handsome and together, and is only just wanting to love this woman. But then there are also times where you feel, is there a way we could get a little closer to what Othello is feeling? He seems so reactionary and never really pushing forward his own agenda in a positive way. I felt that a lot because the change in Othello came very quickly. And it's a change that is like a cat and dog between Iago planting this seed, you know, Desdemona is unfaithful, and Othello little by little buying it until he's just, boom, you know, she's betraying me. And I wondered, is that really Othello? Or is that now Shakespeare's kind of ducking and saying, well, I'm going to present the Moor as, you know, unstable and kind of crazy, and, you know, I'm going to fall into what the popular ideas of the Moor and the fear of the other. were. And I think that's what makes it a little bit of both. There's tension there. There's tension between wanting to present Othello and have him brave this world, and is there actually the meat there for Othello to really present himself and grapple with what he is doing, as he says he wants to do. You know, he says, you know, Desdemona came to me and was like, someone said you had this story, and would you tell me, you know, your story? And he's like, of course, I'm going to be the one to tell you my story. You know, I'm going to let someone else tell you my story.
Right.
Othello really wants to present himself, but as a character, you feel there is a block there.
Okay, so that's interesting, because at that time, in 1600, there was actually an ambassador who visited England and stayed at court, at Queen Elizabeth's court. And he was an ambassador from Barbary, which at that time would have been, Barbary then is Morocco now. And he was actually considered a celebrity. And so when you talk about this idea that Othello seemed to you to be somewhat two-dimensional at times, you know, Shakespeare may have, and this is conjecture, but I think some scholars have argued this, is that this was something that was popular and intriguing to people at the time, this other who came and visited and everybody was sort of in awe of. And maybe he just felt compelled to write a play featuring such a character, you know? And I mean, obviously the story is also based on Cinthio's story, which was written previously. And it's called a Moorish Captain. And so there are a lot of different ideas probably jogging around in Shakespeare's head when he was writing this. And whether his motives were more about writing something that would bring in the masses, or, you know, it's impossible to say. But in Shakespeare, language is certainly the roadmap for an actor. And what characters say about themselves and what other characters say about them are critical to understanding who they are and what they want. And there are certainly a lot of beautiful, beautiful, incredibly powerful, very thought-provoking and deep lines that Othello has. And there are also challenging ones. And the same thing goes for what people say about Othello. Some wonderful things. Desdemona certainly has her fair share of wonderful things to say about Othello. But then other characters like Iago, like Brabantio, have some horribly negative and nasty things to say. So were there specific lines that were either spoken by you as Othello, or lines spoken about you by other characters that had a profound impact on you as you were rehearsing? Things that you wrestled with during rehearsal in either a positive or a negative way?
Well, definitely a negative way was, you know, such a thing as thou. I remember that. I think that's coming from Brabantio. It's in the opening. And I think that is hard on Othello, because here he's being called a thing, not even a man, not even a woman, just that thing. And I remember thinking, that's hard. That's hard just to hear that. And while, Othello's able to, his love overcomes that, it must really hurt, But I do feel one thing that really resonates to me as powerful for Othello is the handkerchief. When he is talking about that handkerchief, to me, it is all of his African ancestry, all of his Moorish ancestry. It's all in there. And this you really feel is important to him. And that is a very positive moment, although he turns it into something, if you lose that handkerchief, you're going to be in trouble with me. But that handkerchief is so powerful to him. It is that purity that is his manhood, his connection to family, all of that, and to his history in a real way that, some of the things he says may be a little bit, made bigger than needed.
There's one line I'd like to ask you about, because I struggled with it, just being on stage with you. And so I'd just like to put it out there. I think it's the Duke of Venice that he's defending Othello to Brabantio, I believe. And he says, your son-in-law is far more fair than black. And I always thought that was such an underhanded compliment, because he is complimenting Othello, but the implication is that being black is bad.
Yeah.
And so whenever I stood there, I always, as an actor and as Desdemona, I never really knew how to respond to that. And I think that maybe is an appropriate reaction. And you always had a sort of puzzled expression on.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, like, what did that line do to you? How did it feel to have it said?
I definitely felt it was an underhanded line, but it's not an underhanded line from someone meaning to be mean, but it shows that the language itself has racism in it, to say that someone is fair makes them better, but I remember singing songs like that, Hymn to the Virgin, when I was in growing up and a chorister, and, you're singing about the Virgin, so fair and white. So it's such a part of our culture that you could miss it. But it is those little things that make you think, oh, what Othello's grappling with really is something very under the surface. Right. It's something that is really a part of the environment. It's there in the soil, of what he's breathing. It's in the air. So it's not so much something, Iago kind of brings it to his face, but it's there, even to imply that someone's, better because they're more fair, more white,
Right. Yeah, you're right, that symbolism is so pervasive still in our culture. And certainly, it's throughout the play constantly. Light, fair, it connotes good, and dark, black connotes bad. And just the existence of that symbolism in the play and throughout in culture widely, how oppressive that must feel. I couldn't speak to that, but I wonder if that.
Yeah.
Well, you said it already, so.
It is oppressive in a way that I think we all get a little bit of that, whether we're on the benefit side or the oppressed side. We all kind of take in a little bit of what that does to the soul, because we're automatically assigning color to emotion. And, I'm not sure if that's natural. I'm really not sure if that's natural. I know that when it's daylight, yes, I can see better. There's more clarity, but I'm not sure if that really has anything to do with people, because melanin is, something completely different. But I think it shows Shakespeare is aware of it, and he uses it. For good or for bad, he uses it to convey what he knows the audience is aware of. I know when I sang that, Hymn to the Virgin, as a chorister, I was a chorister as a kid, I was aware of it too. And I remember thinking, but that for me brought in a sort of consciousness raising, which maybe was not when I was like 9 and 10, but a slowly building of a consciousness about that kind of thing, where I started to think, I'm not just going to always define things as black, as bad, and white as good because I'm black, and even if I'm not, pitch black, I'm, of color. And I think what we all have to do is sort of grapple with it to some extent, whether it benefits us or not, is that right? What does that do? And from a scientific point of view, what is that saying about the world? I know night is often a great space. Night can be peaceful. Darkness can be peaceful, but it is something that we need to think about as a society. And, I don't think it would not be there if Shakespeare didn't know it had some ring of truth to what we do in society on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Shakespeare uses imagery in a way that I think no other playwright has ever been able to harness the power of imagery in such a way as Shakespeare has and does, and to great effect, and sometimes negative effect, sometimes positive, I suppose. But I mean, that's a great segue, because bringing this conversation to the present moment now, there is a major civil rights movement happening as we speak. And change feels like it's coming. At least there's some hope. And I'm just curious, what's your perception, your understanding of the Black Lives Movement and what's happening right now today?
Well, my understanding is that it's a movement that wants people to be seen as equal, all people. I think, yes, it does present Black as Black lives, but it really is about let's all be equal and manifest that. But you can even see, even in language itself, finding equality in language, that's something that we have to grapple with. I don't think I've ever really heard a real discussion nationally about language. We all speak the English language, but the English language, is loaded with things like that, with racialized language. And what does that mean for a multiracial society? So I think I understand it as being a movement that may not have, the leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, but definitely about people mobilizing themselves towards greater awareness and trying to find ways to address systemic racism. Like I was, I think, saying the other day, the racism, yes, it was racist for the policeman to brutally murder, that man. But everything that led up to his life being where it was,
right,
to where he needed to do a counterfeit transaction, or from what we've been told, really is the racism. What happened when he was in prison? What happened when he tried to get out of prison and get a good job? Why didn't he sustain it? What happened in his life when he started dating a white woman? There's a whole relationship between the possibility that he may have known the police officer. And, all of these things, all like Othello, come to a point where it becomes a life or death matter for one person or the other. And I think that's where we need to become more aware that it is the little things. And, perhaps in reducing, racialized language, we are actually starting to, untear some of the struggles that are keeping us from really growing as a society.
Right. Yeah. Well, and we talked about the ways in which racism undermines people's ability to fulfill their purpose. And yeah, it does seem like these little steps happening, but that there's kind of a convergence of it. And it's not that long ago that white men were playing Othello.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last time, at least the last really well-known time, was in 1991. And it wasn't until, I think, 1995 when a Black man actually took the role on, to at least a very well-known production of it, you know, out there, popular culture, Lawrence Fishburne. So how does it make you feel to know that white men were playing Othello for centuries, leading right up until less than 30 years ago?
Well, it makes me understand, you know, where we are, that we haven't really understood as well as we should what it means for someone to tell their own story. You know, a Black person playing Othello is more likely to see in between the lines and grapple with Othello's full character trajectory, I feel, because you're on the line. Your image is on the line, you know, and like Othello, you know, when he's presenting himself, it's like you're carrying your people on your back, and you want to play this role in a way that is triumphant, not demeaning. So I think that a Black man or woman play the character is very important. I mean, I feel why it was done that way is, you know, racism. It's like, it's racism. I mean, I don't, what else? It's not thinking that's important, feeling that, you know, putting on, you know, makeup will give you access. And it's not that those roles weren't done very well. You know, Laurence Olivier did a very awesome Othello. So did Orson Welles did an awesome Othello. But I feel it's not coming from that visceral, they're talking about me, you know? And it has to be that almost animal, like, you know, a person, an animal in the woods, and that's my child, or that, you know, it has to be, that is me who's being torn apart. You know, when Brabantio gets at Othello and starts saying, you know, you other, you this, you really should feel it from the depth, I think, of your soul, and feel that attack to play the role right. And, you know, it may be just as well be played by anyone who's felt that, but I do feel being of the race of the character who's being portrayed gives you that access.
I just have one more question for you, and it's a big one. I always tell my students, I always say to them that Shakespeare is relevant. Shakespeare is now. Everything that Shakespeare wrote about is still true today. You know, the people have not changed that much. The ways we dress, the way we get around, the way we speak has changed. You could say evolved. I might say devolved, depending on what it is. But at the heart of every one of Shakespeare's plays, there is an element of truth that is timeless and something that is pervasive today as it was then. And so what I want to ask to you is, what makes this play meaningful now? What makes it current? How can it speak to a modern audience? And what do you think the takeaway message is, or what it should be with regard to race?
I think the play is relevant now because it talks about what racism does to the mind. It's about what racism does to a person's psychology, you know, and often our society, you know, we look at numbers and we give labels to people, you know, the underprivileged, the this, the that, and we don't really look at the person's soul. And just, you know, from a very psychological, visceral point of view, you do see Othello's soul transform, you know, and you do see what it means for someone to be literally, you know, face to face with racism, both overt and covert, you know, through Brabantio and through Iago. And you see how it becomes a force that he internalizes so that he can no longer see what's good. His relationship with Desdemona, who he was defending to begin with.
Right.
And you just see that is racism. It's like this force that goes 360 degrees that makes someone who should just be pretty much going to the store to buy something lose their life.
Right.
You know? So it's something that is about racism's effect on the soul. And, you know, whether there are some parts of the dialogue that we have to, you know, they may not be presented the best way, but I think it is an honest attempt at trying to dig deeper and understand difference. And I also think it may also show, there's also a part of me that feels like, wow, this is kind of cool. This is a noble guy, and he's got some issues, but he's a noble man. He's not a gangster. He's, you know, got some education. He can speak well. He dresses well. And I like people to know about that too, that there are people like that, and that there was this African presence in early Europe and Tudor England that really was impressive.
Okay, I think we will leave it right there. Thank you so much, Omonike, for joining me for this conversation. I loved being Desdemona to your Othello, and it was such a pleasure getting to relive that experience with you this evening and dissect it and put it all back together.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it was great. And thank you to everybody watching and for joining us in this very important discussion. Please stay tuned, because following this conversation, we will actually have the live premiere of our production of Othello at 7 p.m. So definitely stay tuned. Thank you so much again, Omonike, and thank you to everybody watching out there in virtual world. Stay safe.